Right. Yes. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. So I'll just say a few words of welcome on the behalf of the Nordic Bioethics Committee that I'm chairing this year. And we're currently sort of a small ethics committee under NordForsk, and with 2 representatives from each of the Nordic countries, and also observational members from the Faroe Islands, and with the potential to have also members of Åland and Greenland, but we don't have anyone from those this year. But 2 from Sweden, 2 from Norway, 2 from Finland and Denmark. And we have been working in various working groups on various topics, and the whole idea is to promote information exchange on current ethical issues related to biotechnology, life sciences, medical ethics, and the same. But one of the things that is not so very often highlighted and discussed within bioethics, but in many other fields, is the climate change. And we wanted to address that specific topic and bring that into the conversation that's normally held in bioethics. So for this conference, we wanted to have highlights on the ethical aspects of the health impacts on climate change. So that's the whole purpose of this event. And therefore, we have also speakers covering slightly different angles on this topic and coming from different disciplines. So on the first day, we have a slightly more medical, scientific expertise, and where the ethical viewpoint is slightly newer. And then on day 2, we have a slightly stronger focus from ethicists and bioethics, where the scientific side is perhaps slightly newer, and bring the whole conversation. And then we have also some specific focus on the specific vulnerabilities that the Nordic countries are facing. But we also have the last speaker of today will be joining us on link, Cox McPherson, who is also one of the, she's been one of the pioneering voices of bringing climate change into the topics of bioethics. She is, though not in the Nordic countries, but in Grenada, so she has the whole vulnerable island sea level rising viewpoint, which is, I think, is a very different but very interesting contrast that I think would be very interesting to explore. And with that, I will hand over to one of our 2 moderators for today, which will be Gudrun.
Thank you very much, Madeline. So yeah, my name is Guðrún Valdemarsdóttir, and I am an NCBio member. And together with my colleague Rita Salmelin, I will serve as a moderator today. We have 3 sessions today, and after the second session, we'll have coffee. I just want to say one practical thing in the beginning, and that is, although we are not extremely strict on the timing, we should still respect each other's time. So I will show some paper like this lively paper here when there are 2 minutes left of the speaker's time. But I'm sure that I won't need it. So if we turn to our first session, the first session is about health and climate, the scientific facts and ethical reflections. And I'm honored to tell you that our keynote speaker is Joacim Rocklöv. He is a Humboldt professor at the Heidelberg University and a guest professor at Umeå University. He is an epidemiologist and a modeler focusing and studying the impacts of climate change on health and how climate information can be used for the public, and he uses like artificial intelligence for that. So I'm very pleased to ask you to come to the podium, please.
Does this work now? No? Soon maybe. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. You might be able to lower it a little bit. Let's see if I get my slides. I should probably just find them here. Or will you share the slides? The presentation mode? I can't see it now, right? Okay, while we're waiting. Yeah, so I used to be here in Umeå until very recently, and now I moved to Heidelberg, and I work in global health, so do climate change and environmental studies in global health. My main focus nowadays is actually on infectious diseases, but I have been working on across the spectrum in climate and health. And climate health is a huge field. It incorporates everything, I'd say. And when I talk about findings and the field, one should be aware of that it's a selection of, it's not a comprehensive presentation, because we don't have a comprehensive understanding on, the effects and the impacts, I would say. We know a little bit. It's like we can observe part of the maybe less complex impacts, but a lot of the cascading effects in the society, I think we don't have a good understanding of yet. As an example, I could mention there was a paper recently in Nature Climate Change looking at infectious diseases. It showed that a majority of infectious diseases have some kind of climate sensitivity, documented climate sensitivity, and that climate sensitivity goes through more than 1,000 different pathways, only for infectious diseases. And then infectious diseases is only one part. Obviously, there's a lot of chronic diseases affected as well, and then there's even more pathways. So it's a very big and sometimes daunting task to actually research and try to bring some understanding into climate and health. So just to make it easy for myself, I figured I should actually probably talk a little bit around the Lancet Countdown, which is a big activity that maybe you've seen it. There's an annual report which we produce. There will be a new one in about a month's time, and it gives not a comprehensive picture, but it gives you a quite comprehensive picture of the things that we understand better, at least today, and it shows the trends on how where development is going, and it's the historic to current trends. It's very sort of human-centric in its sort of presentation, and that could be discussed, of course. So what I'm going to present here is not only my own indicators, although we contribute indicators into the Lancet Countdown report every year. I'm not the only one, so I just want to give a little bit of credit to other people. I also want to highlight this because there's going to be a new report coming out in exactly a month from now on health in Europe, which is a little bit deeper, actually. It goes deeper into specific trends, indicators, patterns. So it's definitely worthwhile to keep your eyes open. It would also be published every year in the Lancet Public Health. And there will be a kickoff seminar, I think it's the 28th of October. Okay, so back to climate change and pathways. So climate change affects a lot. It affects CO2, it affects temperature, it affects hydrology, rainfall, droughts, floodings, etc. Extreme events are quite much, I think, discussed and quite easy to actually envision that you have society impacts from. Some other impacts are harder. So heat, for example, it's more a silent killer. And I would say also a lot of infectious disease impacts is also silent. We don't really notice it because it's sort of, gradually aggravating the current situation. So those are very different. So the sort of the shocks and the gradual changes are quite different in how it's affecting. And the shocks would be easier to actually also attribute consequences to if you have data, but the gradual increases are more difficult because then you need to do an attribution and separate climate trends, for example, from other trends in the society that could affect disease. And that for that you need to have certain methods, and modeling is one way of doing it. So that's what I specialize on. Yeah, okay. So the big groups of health impacts that we talk about usually is vector-borne diseases. It could be mental diseases. It could be food system-related diseases and nutrition, diets, etc. And chronic disease or cardiovascular diseases. And this is, again, just a sort of overall description of how it links up. I'm sure this description and this image is not complete in any way. There is a lot of complicated pathways that would not be possible to describe in a simple way. But I think still this captures the big and the more important pathways. It's heat and health, health and extreme weather, climate-sensitive infectious diseases, food security, undernutrition, and migration displacement, and that could be as a consequence of various climate-related issues, but for example, floods and sea levels. To go into some of the observations, this is a vulnerability graphic that we've actually produced. It shows how people are increasingly susceptible to heat-related diseases, and heat-related diseases usually chronic. If you have pre-existing diabetes or other chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, if you live in cities, and if you're older age, you usually have a predisposition to be more affected by heat and have high risk of heat mortality. So this is showing in according to groups of the Human Development Index. It shows basically where the development is taking us currently. And I don't think this would be a surprise to many that we're actually getting more susceptible to heat, and it's mainly because of urbanization and older populations with more chronic diseases. The rise is quite strong, so this would definitely make populations in most places of the world, actually, as it looks, actually, all of these regions more sensitive and susceptible to heat exposure and heat-related mortality. So if we look at the heat exposure in itself, we could also see trends. We could see trends among people over 65 years of age. And we can see trends in populations under 1 year of age. So these are two groups that are susceptible to heat exposure. And the distribution of these exposures and person months of exposure is different. Person days of exposure is different in different countries, and depending on the demographic structure and depending on the exposure. But the overall trend is definitely going up. So we have more sensitive, susceptible populations, and we have more of these type of event exposures, which means that we can expect more mortalities and morbidities from these exposures. There's another important indicator described here, which is actually how we are potentially affected by increasing heat in restricting our safe periods of outdoor exercise and also sort of heavy manual work. And that's also actually going up, so there is more and more hours in the day in all of these regions as well, and especially in the low human development index region, where you have basically less hours where they're safe to exercise or do heavy labor. And that's a quite clear trend as well. There is also potential work. This is an estimate, that's why it says potential. But there is an estimate of a large number of work hours lost due to heat as well. And specifically in low human development index, so poorer areas, this estimate is higher, and in the agricultural sector in those areas. So that's definitely an interesting, going to the theme of the conference, I think that's very interesting and important, because you have a lot of consequences from reduction in productivity indirectly on health and the economy, society, livelihoods, etc. While it's the populations in the low human development index regions who's most affected, it's not them who actually emitted most of the emissions, but they are more susceptible, and the society as a whole is likely to be impacted by this. Another indicator that's shown here is actually expressing is an indicator. There is no actually yet so far good estimate of how we are sort of affected mentally and well-being wise from exposures and climate. There's a lot of different pathways from exposures like floods or heat where you would expect actually mental health impacts, but there's no good indicator yet that we actually can talk about and present. But there's this indicator from social media, which is interesting in a sense, because it captures something maybe more subtle. It shows that during heat exposure periods, there is more negative sentiments in social media, in this case Twitter. So there seemed to be like a short-term relationship between negative sentiments, could be those that are aggressive also with heat exposure, and it's also been well known for a long time in the heat literature that you could actually tend to be more aggressive in situations when you're under strong heat exposure. But this is just indicating then that we also see an increased, at least short-term trend from 2020 up, although it varies a little bit. It does sort of relate to heat exposure, because that's the negative sentiments in association to heat exposure. With a lot of new data sources like social media and other sources, there's quite a lot of possibilities to actually deepen these type of analysis. I wanted to talk about this study as well, so I'm not only talking about Lancet countdown indicators, but this was a study that was published maybe half a year or a year back, and it basically shows that if we look into the associations and the heat-related mortality associations. And then we compare that to climate, which would be prehistorical. So basically, if we in a model use a prehistoric climate today, and then we look at the difference in terms of the heat-related mortality that we attribute, then we would already now estimate that 37% of those heat-related mortalities that occur today would not have occurred in the prehistoric situation. So this is a little bit theoretical because there's obviously no possibility to assess this without actually making models and model predictions. And there is no Earth where we have the prehistoric climate today. But it's an interesting comparison still, because I think this is probably about the best you can do in terms of understanding the difference between prehistoric climate conditions and current climate conditions, and how much we've actually contributed to that in anthropogenic warming, and how much that spills over into heat-related mortalities. Okay. Wildfires is also something that's increasing quite a bit, and wildfires could also have a lot of different health impacts, not the least the smoke that usually large populations are exposed to during wildfires, but also obviously the social, economical impacts from maybe properties and houses and insecurity, etc. So 60% of countries had an increase in the number of people exposed to very high or extremely high danger of fire in the last years compared to early 2000. This indicator doesn't actually show the smoke exposure and populations exposed to smoke and attributes mortality to that smoke or pollution. But there will be an indicator in this new European report that's published in a month that actually captures that better. And hopefully we'll have better estimates onwards to describe also pollution impact. Yeah, and you can see the distribution is really not really even in these impacts, which is also a little bit like this labor productivity, for example. A lot of the impacts are expected generally to be not only for fires, but generally to be in populations where you have a low degree of development, so a low development index, where you have more susceptible people with less ability to adapt to these exposures. Yeah. There's also droughts. So 19% of the global land surface was affected by droughts in 2020. This doesn't actually, the map only describes 2020. You see quite a large number of areas with drought conditions. Be interesting to look at the updated map for 2022, given that there's been a lot of such situations recently. And according to the trends to the left, you could also expect this to continue, really. It's quite a strong pickup in the last decades. And that's in a bit the same for most of the graphics we look at. We see that kind of strong pickup in terms of exposures and health impacts over the last 20, 30 years, and corresponding to the warming. Here's another number of indicators. This is a little bit crammed in. It's infectious disease indicators. So you see, for example, Vibrio exposure, which is common in the Baltic Sea and also along the east coast of the US and North America. The Vibrio bacteria is actually abundant in most of the waters, in brackish waters, for example, where there is a little bit lower salinity. And when the temperature gets high enough, it grows, and then it can affect, either it can affect you through us through seafood, which is very common in the US. You get a lot of infections of Vibrio, which could be quite severe from oyster consumption. But we also have a rise in cases in the Baltic, and that's rather more related to direct exposure. So you get exposed into wounds, etc., and can get severe complications like septicemia and necrotizing wound infections, etc. So that's one, and then Vibrio cholera. The Vibrio is actually showing very strong trends, and it's very climate sensitive. Looking at Swedish data, you have peaks really coinciding exactly almost with the warmest years. You see big jumps in from year to year depending on the summer temperatures and the sea surface temperatures. So that's one consequence. We have cholera as well, where you see a little bit lower trend. Cholera, this indicator doesn't actually capture secondary transmission through the fecal-oral route. It actually captures more the reservoir conditions for cholera and for cholera spillover into human populations through sea surface, for example, in more tropical areas. But that's also changing, and in some areas increasing in suitability. Malaria is one important climate-sensitive disease as well. It still kills a lot of people, and mostly children. Malaria is it's more complex in its relationship to climate, because it's a little bit sensitive also to heat. So you'd actually expect malaria in the future, you would expect it to actually probably have lower suitability and are not a potential for transmission in some of the African regions. While still, because it increases its suitability in the highlands, you'd have a much larger population at risk. So even if you see that type of compensation, you see a much higher risk overall, because it increases up in the highlands. And it's quite problematic in a sense, because then you actually have more emergence and suitability of malaria in areas where you don't really have had exposure to the same degree throughout your whole life, and that could cause a new kind of epidemiological different situation, because there's some protectivity with having been exposed before. So that's really something that's not measured here, but an additional layer that we need to consider. Dengue has been expanding hugely over the last 30 years, and it's one of those diseases that's driven by human activities. So mobility, definitely a very important driver of dengue, and climate conditions in its emergence. Thinking about expansion of a disease, you need several things to sort of interact to lead to that expansion. And you wouldn't have any emergence of dengue unless you have suitable conditions for the mosquitoes to replicate virus and to spread it to humans. It's a necessary condition. So there is no actual emergence without suitable climate. And climate is becoming more suitable in a lot of locations. So here, this is the global, again, description of how the R-naught is actually picking up over the last 3 decades again. And during this period, the incidence has also increased hugely, the global incidence. But then mobility is also part of shaping that scenario. So in thinking about what climate creates as risks in the future, it's also important to consider the co-acting factors. In this case, both emergence and transmissions, like hyperendemicity, is going to be fueled by climate and mobility, mainly. And those would both probably increase, I assume, in the future quite a bit. So we have, in a sense, two different synergistic effects to adapt to. And it's going to continue changing quite a bit onwards. This is a projection that we did a number of years back, which shows dengue vectors and the abundance of dengue vectors and how the population, the mosquito population numbers are obviously important in the transmission dynamics. And this projection shows in the future how it's likely to continue to increase, and depending on the climate scenario. So if we have less mitigation of climate, then we'll have much more vectors, up to 30% more in average globally. So that's a huge number. There's large areas in Africa, in southern part or mid-southern part, where you have much more suitability and abundance according to the models. And if we manage to go for something similar to the Paris Agreement, you will level out in 2040 or 50 or something like, and have still a quite big increase in abundance, but not as big. So this is obviously also very important to consider. We usually look at these trends here in the indicators with the Lancet countdown up to 2020 or so, but it's likely, according to this projection at least, it's likely that that trend will continue for a number of years. And it also looks likely that whatever we basically do, we're going to face a situation with continued warming up to a couple of degrees, and that's going to mean that you have much more vectors, you have much higher reproductive values, and more fearful outbreaks and emergence in new areas. Just want to mention something else when talking about infectious diseases, which is probably going to be incorporated among the indicators onwards in future years. It's these complex pathways between spillover, deforestation, which has both a mitigation side with Amazon forests, and it acts as a sort of carbon sink, and you have these effects on the viruses and pathogens, where you have more replication, which is sort of directly related to climate. Plus, you have impacts on animal species would need to adapt to climate change as well. They usually do adapt to new situations. Some of them might not be able to adapt so efficiently, but in that adaptation, you're going to have a lot of cross sort of animal species sharing between different animal species, and you might have much more spillovers to human as well. Because you have more mixing of different species, that's likely to happen. Over the last 100 years, there has been more of these type of events. It's probably not so much driven by climate, but honestly, we don't really know, I'd say. It's quite complicated pathways to study and complex systems. But this is really important, and it's really important to actually describe and understand how both our impacts on the mitigation and the carbon sink, deforestation, and biodiversity is leading to more of these type of spillover events, which could lead to zoonotic emergence or pandemics, but also to understand actually the impacts and how that's also species distributions and transmission potential and potential health impacts, how that's affected by spider warming, which is not described. So IPCC, for example, doesn't describe these type of events much at all. It's really, and the One Health panel and doesn't describe climate change so much. They talk about biodiversity, environment, but like there's a little bit of, I don't know, siloed approaches and assessment in that sense, I would say, at least. This is a rather new study from Nature where people looked at this type of species distribution impacts. So they looked at over 3,000 mammal species and estimated how they would redistribute in the future climate in 2070. And then they also looked at the genetic expression of the viruses that these mammals are known to carry, and looked at whether those viruses would also be potentially jumping from one mammal species to another if the mammal species had shown susceptibility to that virus. And based on this analysis, they estimated that there will be, just due to climate change and land use change associated with climate, you'd see maybe up to 4,000 more times more of these type of cross-species viral sharing. And that's also happening in locations where humans are much more abundant. So it's quite likely that that would also spill over. Some of these would also spill over to humans and cause zoonotic emergence and potentially even new pandemics. Okay, so there's also impacts on the food system, and the food system is obviously a very big sector. So these are predictions based on models which have been calibrated by a lot of data, of course, indicating that maize could reduce by 6%, wheat by 3%, soybean 5.4%, or have been reduced now compared to 81 to 2010. So that's a quite big change for a short period, I would say. What's also actually interesting in the food system and health is that there are studies indicating that because of the increased concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll have lower micronutrient contents in these type of crops. And that means that we'd have less proteins and other important sources of micronutrients and especially people in low middle income countries where the Human Development Index is low, is much more susceptible because they depend to a larger extent on these micronutrients in their daily intake. So there are studies actually estimating future huge increases in morbidity across a range of diseases just because of these micronutrient reductions from the CO2 rise. Sea level rise is also very important, obviously. It's difficult to estimate the direct health impacts from this or the indirect health impacts from this because it's such a big topic. But we can expect a lot of people to migrate somewhere else if the sea level rises up to 5 meters. You see a huge impact. Okay, so next thing, I only have a few slides. I think I'm running out of time soon, right? Yeah. So next thing is basically how well do we adapt to these situations? And the adaptation plans and strategies is in different countries is really lagging behind. So there's much less done in terms of adaptations. And also looking at studies, there's much less studies on looking at how we effectively can adapt to the situations, what interventions would be most effective, and so on. And also, if you look at from the global perspective, again, there's very much high-income regions to low-income region gradient here. Another indicator that comes out, which is also part of the European report, but the global here as well, is the transport-related, so basically emission, pollution related deaths in air pollution, which is very much depending on our combustion of fossil fuels, car traffic, for example. And those numbers are very large, distributed across sectors. So agriculture is also one important, transport, industry, etc. Very large numbers, which are very much depending on emissions from fossil fuel. If you look at a specific sector, there are solutions, and transitions would obviously mean that we have large gains in terms of health impacts in this domain. So this is referred to as a co-benefit of mitigation. These indicators that show reductions in mortalities, for example, due to cutting emissions are referred to as co-benefit indicators. There's a similar indicator for nutrition, which is actually showing the potential gains of health impacts related to diet and nutrition, and at the same time how much of our food consumption that's actually contributing largely to CO2 emissions. And it's probably no surprise to anyone here that meat consumptions and red meat consumption is very big. It depends also on where the meat comes from. So if the meat is actually from Brazil, and you've also had deforestation associated with it, you'd expect maybe even larger impacts. So this is also a very important opportunity to actually gain and to find these transition opportunities. So it's not only the impacts from the exposures itself, it's also the potential health gains of making the transition we need to make in order to reduce emissions and to change our path. Last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is that there's a lot of studies, increase in studies. There's not a lot of studies, but there's quite a large increase in studies and research activity in this field. But it's also, again, very uneven when you look at the tropics and the high-income countries to the low-income countries. So really where we expect, again, a lot of the impacts to be, and where we expect a lot of the adaptation and vulnerabilities to be largest, there's much less research. So this is obviously also an ethical issue. How can we really adapt? And it also has a little bit of a colonial type of side issue, given that there is not really enough local researchers in places where we expect most of the impacts to actually develop adaptation, develop ways to cope with the stress. That said, there is obviously a lot of global issues that need to be tackled, and that could help a lot in terms of cutting emissions and transforming food systems, etc. I think my main ethical perspective is, which you might have noticed, is very much this sort of low middle income country impact versus us actually having been the most contributing most to emissions and contributing most to the situations, and maybe also gained most from emitting in terms of our welfare and society. And that obviously I think is a very, very important consideration in how we tackle this. So I hope that gave you a little bit an overview on where we stand today. It's not comprehensive, as I said. I think even the presentation here, I have the feeling it's just the tip of the iceberg that we can actually see, and that's much more obviously in terms of the complex impacts and systemic impacts. That's very difficult to describe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joacim, for addressing these important points. Are there any questions from the audience? I will bring the microphone to those who would like to address a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a very nice talk. You say that your ethical takeaway from this is, I understand it, fairness, that the countries most affected are those less, that didn't cause the climate crisis. How do you think that can be dealt with? Like, how can that be solved in a sense?
I think one thing is our responsibility and sharing of our wealth, because we've actually benefited largely from this development, and the economic development has been very much depending on fossil fuels up to today. So one thing is also obviously, but then there's this colonialism issue, which is difficult, and we had this discussion before on how do you actually, do you have enough capacity, and how do you build capacity to cope with this? It's not a simple issue, I would say, in the end. But I think we have a large responsibility in causing a lot of the crisis, and also maybe responsibility in solving it. And scaling up solutions, which is not only for us. I don't know if maybe you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, but I also think it's interesting that, as I understand, you say that it's also a financial issue, that those who were a bigger cause should then pay for that damage. Makes a lot of sense. I just think it's a hard pitch usually to the countries with money are not so keen on kind of lowering their living standards or of moving their funds into the countries more affected.
No, I agree.
So I think that you have to find an incitament for that, but I don't have a great answer. I agree, but I think it's complicated to push them into that.
Yeah. It is complicated, I'm sure.
I had a very tiny question about the things you said about the food system and how the CO2 emission affected the micro and nutrients in the food.
Yeah.
I was wondering how, if you knew.
It's in the growth. I think mainly because it goes faster with higher CO2. So the growth of a lot of these crops actually faster, and then it generates less of proteins and zinc and micronutrients. That's very important for children, for example, growing up and having more of a crop-based daily diet. I'm not a dietist.
No, but it makes perfect sense. I just didn't grasp the path.
Yeah, so it's a different pathway. It's from the CO2 concentrations, basically.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You didn't mention conflicts or war. Could you speculate on that climate change as a driving force for military conflicts and war, if we look at, for instance, Syria and now Ukraine? Do we face a future with increasing military conflicts because of the climate change and the migration and impossibilities for people to stay where they have been because they can't support themselves, and what we already are seeing. Have you been able to model anything like that?
There's a study actually on which associate conflict to climate extremes in Africa. I think it was from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. It's difficult to study empirically, but I mean, if you just think about it, it's quite apparent. Like if you don't have water, if you don't have food, it's unstable. You know, the governance would be unstable, and you probably see this type of impact for sure. And they would have cascading effects. They would have systemic effects, and so on. So it's just at a different level than I'm more of an epidemiologist, but I do realize that health depends very much on those effects as well. That could be geopolitical. So I think it's also a very, very important issue to be aware of, and I think it could be described better actually, and probably it has been described. I would be surprised if not the military at least is also considering this as a real potent threat in geopolitical politics and military. So that's, yeah, no, it's definitely a very serious issue.
Yeah, my name is Sigurður Kristinsson, also on the committee from Iceland. Thank you for a very good talk. And I have two questions. One is about the crop yield potential reducing. One of the studies you told us about. Does that reduction in potential take into account the possibility of new areas becoming possible areas for yielding crops where it was too cold, for example, or too something else? Climate was not suitable before. So that's one question. Another one is more like ethical, because so if the industrialized countries who have already benefited a lot from the sources of climate change, they have maybe two major obligations. One is to transition to sustainable energy sources. That's a huge task. And the other is to mitigate the consequences, not only in their own countries, but primarily in other countries. And perhaps also allowing other countries time to develop, and so not apply the same standards. So these are two great tasks that I think are ethically important, and I wonder if you agree and how you would prioritize these two. So, yeah.
Very good questions. Yeah, I think for the food crop, it's the ones I was showing is biological, and it's aggregated for the globe, so it actually shows the net effect. And if you zoom into a specific region, a specific locality, you'd see different. So you'd see, obviously, that you can probably grow more things up north, and in some areas which are already stressed in terms of water and heat, you might have a lower potential. But you might have another potential if you change another crop. So part of adaptation is also thinking about what would we actually need to do different now when we think about what crops to plant where. That's one consequence. Another thing, it's that indicator is insufficient in itself because it doesn't actually include these productivity agriculture components, for example, with heat. You'd also expect probably to have a reduced productivity for periods at least, and maybe I'll be working in a project with Burkina Faso, which is quite hot. It's quite dry. Periodically, at least, they have floods as well. But and in those situations, actually, the people, which are usually women working in the fields, subsistence farmers, are quite a lot affected by the heat. So the productivity goes down during those periods, and that's also something that should be considered when you think about food production. I think, unless we're thinking of having robots doing everything, I don't know. But yeah, so that's quite important. The other question about adaptation versus mitigation, or mitigating the impacts, first of all, we don't have a comprehensive understanding of what the impacts will be, so there's large uncertainties in terms of actually dealing with something that we don't really fully understand. I think that's important to consider. The other thing is that there's limits to adaptation. So even if we adapt as good as we possibly can, we're not going to be able to adapt perfectly, I think. And the IPCC in its last report from 2014 had limits to adaptation graphic. And if you look at different pathways of diseases specifically, some of the heat impacts are going to be very difficult. And some of the infectious disease impacts we don't really have, currently at least, a lot of good tools to adapt to. We can do part of it, but not all. If you think about then mitigation of climate change, that would be going to the root type of prevention. So I would throw my dollars into mitigation of climate change as much as possible currently, but at the same time try to do as much as we can about the impacts and consequences. And then we don't know about geoengineering, etc. Maybe that would also be a solution, but that would have other ethical dilemmas, I think, which is also interesting, because I have the feeling that at some point when this would actually accelerate, people would just accept to do geoengineering because it would be such a stress situation, but I don't know. The discussion is not really reflecting that today, I think. But I think in political decisions, it would be maybe even, it would be a different situation in the future.
Thank you. I would like to ask something more, perhaps within the area here that you talked about, and I'm not sure you mentioned, but I'll ask the question anyway, and has to do with the diseases. And I was wondering, diseases usually connected to local areas where also climate change is mostly affected. Could we potentially see spread to other areas where they have not been known to exist before? As it gets warmer, it may spread through in different ways. I guess through animals, also spread through humans with perhaps mass migration, and to areas where there hasn't been very hospitable for certain, I'm not sure, bacteria or mosquitoes and so on.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. So basically disease emergence would be certain types of disease. I mentioned this study on infectious diseases where a majority, I think 57% of all infectious diseases that they've actually went through in this Nature publication was actually had some kind of climate sensitivity. So that means, and if it's driven by animals or mammals, for example, as hosts, or mosquito vectors, it's definitely climate sensitive. And you would expect emergence when climate reaches certain thresholds, and then over those thresholds increasing transmission pressure. It's not the only thing. Usually you depend on migration as well. So it's an interaction when it comes to emergence of migration of humans or mobility, or even bird migration. So West Nile is an interesting example for Europe, where we have an increased frequency of human cases in some areas. It's definitely moving northwards and expanding at the moment. It seems to be very much driven by climate, but it's also depending on bird migration, for example, and local mosquitoes. But the mosquitoes for that specific disease are abundant. It's just that they in much more areas than where the virus is. It's just that they're not capable, because the climate is not enough suitable. They're not capable of actually replicate and transmit the virus and grow in numbers, etc. So very much so.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
is there any rough number on when we expect to see such
Emergence?
Yes. Yes.
It depends on what disease you look at, because they function a little bit different in their climate sensitivity. And but what you can do is you could use these climate scenarios that I was showing before, and then if you have a model that can well describe the epidemiology in relation to climate, and maybe including mosquitoes and animals, then you could start making risk assessments for areas and emergence. And I think that's one way to guide adaptation in the, a decade or 2 or 3 from now, for example. There's some studies on that. We need much more, but it's possible to prepare a little bit for those, for some of those at least, and then some of them are much more complex, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk and answers, Joacim, and the audience. Thank you for relevant questions. So,
the questions was very interesting.
Maybe you should give him a big applause again. So.
And we'll move on to the next session, where we have 3 speakers on the topic of moving more towards Nordic effects, vulnerability to responsibilities. And speakers range from economics to medicine. First speaker is Joan Nymand Larsen, Professor of Economics, University of Akureyri, Iceland, and Stefansson Arctic Institute, where she's Senior Scientist and Research Director. She has also been a coordinating lead author for the Polar Regions chapter of an IPCC report. So she's going to talk on the topic is still the same as in the program. Climate change, ethics and Arctic human well-being, reflections from research in Greenlandic coastal communities.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come here. I'm an economist, so my talk is going to be a little bit different. Most of my work is focused on the Arctic, where I work on quality of life, living conditions, and impacts of climate change. And today I'm going to talk to you about climate change, ethics, and Arctic human well-being, and I'm going to provide some reflections from research in Greenlandic coastal communities, where I work together with my international colleagues. Actually, one of them is here, Aya. And we are working in an interdisciplinary way and in co-production with local residents. In my talk, I'm going to focus in on climate, but more specifically permafrost thaw and Arctic human well-being. When we talk about Arctic human well-being within the research groups that I'm part of, we look at it in a more holistic way. So it includes health and well-being, but it also includes cultural well-being, fate control, contact with nature, material well-being, and education. So it's very comprehensive. When we talk about climate, we are also talking about a social challenge. And that means that we must consider ethics. We must consider equality and how outcomes can be done in a just and fair way. That also means that in order to arrive at a just and equal outcome, risk management and adaptation strategies, they need to reflect the cultural context, the social context. And this is why we need to co-produce with local communities and get their perspectives. So that very much explains sort of the way in which we work. So what I wanted to do today is also to introduce you to a conceptual framework that we have produced for studying risk from permafrost thaw, where scientists and local communities work together to co-produce the key risks, or understand the key risks, and co-produce adaptation strategies. And then I wanted to talk to you about what kind of major risks we have identified in co-production with local stakeholders in Disco Bay, And then at the end, I wanted to just touch a little bit on a conceptual framework we are starting to work on for devising indicators to help assess the effectiveness of adaptation strategies. So here is just briefly the two areas in which I work on climate issues. There is a disco that I will mainly focus in on in my talk today, where we are focusing in on permafrost thaw. But I also have a case study in South Greenland, but these are different climate factors we are dealing with there, and where we are trying to identify what it is in life that people value, and that will then feed into creating an indicator framework for tracking impacts of global change on local society. But back to Disco Bay. So Disco Bay is where I'm involved in this EU-funded project called Nunateriuk. And we have a field site in the Nordic area on the west coast of Greenland at Ilulissat and Kyugasasuaq. And the purpose here is to work in co-production with the locals to assess the impact of permafrost thaw on the coastal system and its effect on availability and accessibility of resources, the stability of infrastructure, the growth of potential new economic activities, and pollution and health. A high proportion of the Arctic population live along these permafrost coasts, and many of them derive their livelihoods from marine resources, and therefore, as climate is changing, it affects their livelihoods. Now, when we look at this permafrost coast, the physical aspects of it is pretty much similar across the Arctic. But because of differences in the historical, societal, and infrastructural context, the way in which permafrost affects people differs from place to place. And for that reason, we need to dive into the local areas to understand the societal context and the impacts there, and work in co-production with locals, which also then, of course, enables us to gather their perceptions of risks in those localities. So just to speak a little bit more about the approach, because that's really where the sort of ethical angle comes in. Because of the very complexity and multidimensional aspect of climate change, and in this case, thawing permafrost, it makes very little sense, if any at all, to try and tackle that kind of science coming from just one discipline. So for that very basic reason, we must work in an interdisciplinary way. But we must also work in co-production with local communities, because in order to understand the different aspects of the way in which permafrost thaw affects people, we need to look at both scientific evidence, but we also need to understand local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and traditional knowledge. So that is the way in which we work. These communities that we are working with, and we work with them through different ways. I mean, we have focus groups, we have community meetings, we have one-on-one interviews, surveys, etc., and dialogue on the various challenges. These communities are what we would call vulnerable, in the sense that there is scarcity of human and physical resources. There is a lack of critical infrastructure. There is often very high use-out migration, high unemployment, housing shortages, etc. So all the different factors that brings together and creates a vulnerable setting. Because of this vulnerability and because of the scarcity of physical resources in these places, climate change and permafrost is not exactly the highest priority on the list. Social issues are the high suicide rates, the high social problems, the unemployment, etc. That is what what gets more attention. So when we look at these communities, we already know from the get-go that the resources to deal with the issues are limited. And what that means is that there are certain trade-offs. There are many priorities, but we have to realize that there are trade-offs, and what that means is that those people who are not part of the conversation, who are vulnerable, and who are not included, may risk being left out of consideration when money is allocated. And so that can present an ethical dilemma, also because many of the groups that we are working with are already socially or culturally marginalized. So they tend to also experience risk differently, or are more exposed to the risks of climate change because of their limited access to resources. So here is the conceptual framework that we have developed to study risk from permafrost thaw. It's a framework that basically describes the process by which large scientific projects, such as the Nunatariac project that I am working with in Disco Bay, how such a large project of interdisciplinary scientists can work with locals and stakeholders, and together arrive at the main risks from permafrost thaw, and then devise adaptation and mitigation strategies to address those risks. In order to arrive at a just and equitable outcome, it is important that risk management and adaptation strategies reflect the cultural and societal context. In order for that to happen, we must work in this kind of co-production. And this particular framework is one that has tried to tease out what are the processes, what are the steps for doing that. At the very corner or central part of this conceptual framework is the notion of the dual dimension of risk, which basically is a notion that recognizes that there are two components to risk. There is the physical, which is where we talk about matters of fact, or we talk about hazards, probabilities, and consequence. But then there's also the social, which is socially constructed based on cultural values and goals. And the only way in which we can understand that socially constructed aspect of risk, we must work with local communities. So this is kind of our door in as scientists to the communities where we engage, and we find out what are the divergent views, who perceive these and these risks as high or low. So it is a matter of talking to people to identify what are the perceived risk or the risk perceptions. So one piece of output that we have arrived at, and this is just to have a little bit of health on the agenda, is the impact on human well-being or on mental health. So our team worked together in Kukatasuaq and Ilulissat to gather data in co-production with locals, but also via a survey on mental health and on people's self-rated health. And just sort of in short, the results are that for many locals, permafrost thaw does not present a direct risk to their mental well-being. There are challenges and worries and concerns that locals have, however, that relate to infrastructure. It relates to traditional culture and the concern of maybe the future will be one without the possibility to go dog sledding. Or it could be about the future in terms of how is the government going to allocate these scarce funds to different possible adaptation strategies, and will there be enough money to do the critical repairs or renovations regarding the infrastructure that is damaged by permafrost and the permafrost thawing. The survey that was conducted on Kukatasuaq Island, which is a predominantly indigenous community, found that permafrost thaw is not significantly associated with self-rated well-being, quality of life, and satisfaction with life that describe the mental wellness of local people. Aside from this, we were having a range of different settings and dialogues with locals in the town of Ilulissat to talk to them about the different dimensions of human well-being and gathering data on to what extent they saw these different and prominent aspects of human well-being as being impacted by thawing permafrost. And the results from this work, which is still in progress and still needs to be published, is that in general, there are concerns regarding all of these elements of human well-being. In our work as well, in having this collaboration and co-production with locals, we have been able to identify a number of domains for key risks. So for example, there are risks to health and well-being, to infrastructure failure, to material well-being, to being in nature, to cultural heritage, to food and water security, to fate control, and to travel and transportation. When we were in Ilulissat on one of our more recent field trips there, we were also interviewing a number of people about how they would rate their risk perceptions relative to these different key risk domains. So we asked a number of interviewees to rate on a scale from 1 to 10 their risk perceptions related to, for example, health and well-being and fate control and material well-being and so forth. And what came out in this is that there is a broad diversity in how people rate it, and clearly how people's perception of the impacts of permafrost and the risks associated with these impacts differ, of course, depending on, you know, your role, your responsibility, your place in society, and your access to resources. So, for example, government, the Department of Finance, would rank the risk of permafrost to material well-being rather high, as well as to infrastructure, just to give you an example. In these discussions, we were also talking to different departments and different entities, etc. And for example, we talked to a housing company that could tell us about the impact in houses in the area, and many of them relate to health and well-being. You know, there are sewage problems, there is mold, there is floors that are tilting, there are difficulties opening and closing doors and windows. There was also accounts of one workplace in which the floor was slanting so much that an employee was saying, I get dizzy in the morning when I get into work. And as a temporary kind of autonomous fix to this problem, a cooler had been placed underneath the floor to try and prevent further damage or sinking or tilting of the floor. And then you might ask, why don't they do more? And it comes back to the problem of communities are vulnerable in these areas. The financial resources are simply not there to address these problems that everybody can see. They're scarce because there are social issues that mount much higher, and the planning horizon tends to be very short. So if these communities, and this is what we hear, if they certainly have the technical expertise to deal with all of these issues from permafrost thaw, but they don't have the financial resources. So this brings up these ethical considerations in that trade-offs need to be made. And this is where it is important that everybody's voice is being heard, that there is inclusiveness in the process, so that those people who are already vulnerable or left out of the conversation somehow, that their situation does not get somehow exacerbated by the way in which decisions regarding where to funnel scarce resources is being made. Just for a moment, I just wanted to look further south, but I come back to the north in one additional slide before I finish off today. But in the south, they also deal with, and they also have problems of climate change. It's more about storms and melting sea ice. It's not about permafrost. But I have a project down in Greenlandic in South Greenland where we are looking at devising value indicators. We want to know what it is people value in life, and that is going to feed into certain key research questions we have. I just wanted to touch upon it here, just to flag to you that these things that deal with human health and well-being, as you can see here from the list, in terms of human security, flourishing, belonging, respect, equality, and rights, are things that people in these coastal communities are valuing. This kind of method or data can help feed into work or conceptual framework for devising indicators to both track the societal impacts of permafrost thaw or other climate change, or to assess the effectiveness of adaptation strategies that are applied. So that brings me back just finally here, the framework for monitoring and assessing impacts of permafrost thaw in the case of Disko Bay. Here we are just starting now on the work to conceptualize, first of all, and then later it becomes more practical, a framework for devising indicators. And we are taking as a point of departure an existing Arctic social indicator framework that me and my colleagues developed several years ago, that simply where the framework is the most prominent aspects of human well-being, namely health and well-being, material well-being, education, fate control, contact with nature, and cultural well-being. So it goes beyond the United Nations Human Development Index that only looks at 3 of these, but there are these additional components that deal with culture and nature that are important to northern people. Now, in order to adjust that or fit it into dealing not with human development per se, but the impacts of climate change, we need to go back and listen to what our communities are saying about what is happening with the impact of thawing permafrost. So clearly, we will need here to augment this framework and add the biophysical, so it's both Arctic social and biophysical indicators, and one additional domain that we need to introduce is culture. Also, in addition, in order to think about ethical consideration, it becomes important that we also allow these kind of frameworks for indicators that help assess effectiveness of adaptation and mitigation to also be based on primary data collection when we measure indicators, because clearly in order to be inclusive, we also need to measure, for example, contribution made to well-being from harvest, from the traditional sector. That requires primary data collection, and these prior frameworks that I've been part of have tried to avoid indicators or domains where primary data collection was needed, simply because the money and the time to go and collect that data does not exist. So if you produce a framework like that, it's likely not going to be used. So if you want it to really be used, you know, we try to make it in a way that it's easy to measure indicators based on already published data. However, if we think about the ethical aspects of this, we in the North we need to find ways in which primary data can be collected for these kind of frameworks. Then just for the fun of it, I guess here towards the end, this is my second to last slide. I just wanted to ask that question of, are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, can they be useful or relevant for devising such a framework of indicators for the Arctic? Most of us who work in the Arctic, we know that the SDGs are not particularly suitable for the Arctic environment. They certainly were not produced with the Arctic in mind. So there are various things more specific to the Arctic that does not seem to be addressed. However, when we look at the SDGs, we can ourselves be inspired. There are certain elements that we have not been including into our frameworks, such as, for example, to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all, or to build resilient infrastructure and promote inclusive, sustainable development. These would be two examples of maybe SDGs that could help inform this work that lies ahead of us. And then just in summing up, I wanted to say here in conclusion that vulnerable communities and complexity of challenges increases the importance of interdisciplinary research and co-production of knowledge. And prominent aspects of human well-being in the Arctic are impacted by permafrost thaw. That is what our research is showing. Ethical considerations are critical for just and equitable outcomes and to help strengthen adaptation to climate change. Without taking these things into consideration, it becomes difficult to produce effective strategies. Further development of indicator frameworks and in dialogue with locals are needed for assessing societal impacts of climate change. So again, this is work that we are currently starting on. The process has started, but we hope to be able to say more about it in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. It's extremely important to develop metrics for things that you can actually then try to evaluate and measure. Are there questions? We could have one question now, and remember there's a chance to mingle with the speakers over drinks at the end. So there's also a chance for that. Is there a question now? Please feel free. Okay, yes.
Maybe this is a little provocative. I've been to Ilulissat and other places in Greenland several times. And when I'm there, I feel that maybe the main problem is the permafrost. You can't do anything up there. You don't have anything to live from because of the permafrost.
I think, I think that was provocative. That was provocative. I would say that is not what we hear from the locals. The locals in general describe the well-being, despite the permafrost. And the permafrost is not something that necessarily really in any major way worries them. Most of the infrastructure and the built environment is in non-permafrost areas. So I know that in Ilulissat certainly there are areas where there is a built environment as well, and this is the area that we have been partly focusing in on. What is happening now is that some of the infrastructure that is being negatively impacted by permafrost and some of the housing that has been destroyed by it is being closed down, and new is being built in non-permafrost areas. So there's still terrain there for actually building houses. So it's not continuous permafrost in that region.
Thank you. I think would be okay. We'll just continue so we can try to keep the time a little bit. And remember, there's a chance to ask later. So the next speaker is Birgitta Evengård, Professor of Infectious Diseases at Umeå University. And her topic is interdisciplinary research, holistic view for health and well-being.
Well, very nice to be here, to see you all, and thank you for the invitation. I'm here probably mostly because I've been coordinating a Nordic Center of Excellence. Yes, that's mine. For some years, and we came out with a final report at the end of March. Can you all hear me? It's working fine, that's great. The name, what we have focused on in this Nordic Center of Excellence is the climate change and transition of infectious diseases in the north, and how it impacts the health of animals and humans, and also we try to look at the societal effects. When you look with a so-called holistic, there are many words: holistic, One Health, integration. We have a complex issue. We've already heard that from climate change and how it affects us and our lives on this globe. And we are part of this environment, and you can divide the environment into the natural environment, the man-made environment, and then we have ecosystems with animals and also with people. And people live differently. Not everyone goes to the food store to buy, but some people prefer to live this way. And who is where we have to deal with human rights here as well. This is mainly what I'm going to discuss with you the next 15 minutes or so, but let's move a bit to further expand what Joacim described so well for us. And that's just very recently, this article came from the Finnish Meteorological Institute. And the Arctic amplification, that is the speed of climate change in the Arctic, is 4 times faster than in the rest of the globe. The previous IPCC, the latest one on natural environment, came out in August last year. They still state that it's like twice the speed, and even that was considered to be extraordinary. But this Nature publication seems solid. So the speed is worse than we thought before. And this means that things are happening in the Arctic for local communities, the indigenous peoples up here, but also it's a driver for change in the rest of the world. That's why we have to study what's happening here. That's why we very quickly have to draw all the knowledge that we can out of this region, because we are like, I heard someone use the expression, we have to catch a flying bullet, because we can really maybe be preventive or mitigate what's happening in the rest of the world if we understand better. That's why we are in the Arctic. Of course, things also happen in the Antarctic, and research are going on there as well. Yes, so that's why one reason why we should have an Arctic perspective, and it's the speed. So it's a learning lab for the rest of the world. And then, of course, we know that the globe is, the Arctic is very connected to the rest of the world. When I started to work with this in 2007, and I guess still some people, I came from Stockholm here up to Umeå, people in further south, and even here in Umeå, thought that, the Arctic is, we all have the picture, it's the silent, the lonely man skiing across the snow up there, and like the Nansen mythology. Certainly, you all know by now that's not the truth. So it's well connected to the rest of the globe with the currents, the atmospheric interactions, ecological and social systems, commerce and trade. And not to be not mentioned is that these waters are extremely nutrition rich for mammals of different kinds and fishes. So they travel here and they eat and get fat. And when this changes, we will also have an effect on the, if you call it, production of food from the sea or for these ecosystems. And of course, it's the home for indigenous peoples for millennia, supporting global trade for centuries. This part of the world has been always connected to the rest. And this is just one picture for you to show that the big currents in the oceans, that's how they move, bringing warmer water up into the Arctic to cool down, go down, deeper down, and then come up to the surface. That's why we have the Gulf Stream and different streams. That's why we here in Scandinavia have the nice life we do have, climate-wise, so far. So why am I here today? As I briefly started to explain to you, it's because we were fortunate to be funded by NordForsk as one of 4 Nordic Center of Excellences who are supposed to do research for added value to the Nordic countries. And the reason for this is that warming landscapes, migrating vector organisms, change in societal exposure, societal effects, One Health approach. Those of us who joined here, we thought this was really important. And as I said, we have had the final outcome, and we have had about 60 peer-reviewed publications, more to come. We've been to many conferences. We've been in media, all kinds of media, as an important part as well, outreach. And we are accelerating educational impact. We were allowed, encouraged to include Russian colleagues, and we worked a lot with them. I worked a lot, especially the last years. We've seen a bit more of that. And we were given more funding to deepen our contacts, especially with younger colleagues, networking. The contract was signed in the beginning of February, and of course the money was withdrawn. But after a couple of weeks, they said that you can have the money if you take out the Russians. So we did, and we're working now with people in Greenland, and of course with other Nordic friends as well. for added value, but with the same concept. And yeah. We just heard Joan, thank you for your nice talk, Joan. You talked about interdisciplinary. We can all agree upon, we heard Joacim describe it as well, we have very complex problems and we need complex collaborations. I'm an infectious disease doctor, and you know, when we started out, we were like 49 seniors, and when you start out with 49 seniors, I will bring up some personal thoughts about ethics all along, and this is one ethic, I think. When you bring along senior researchers, they are usually in their own little comfort zone, and it's very nice. It's very easy to say, yes, I will do this, and I will step out of my comfort zone when you put your name on the application. But then to deliver is another thing. And because you really have to, and I think it's almost impossible for people, if you have been working for a long time with your own language and field and you have your own network, to really get into, and this is a problem. It's an ethical problem because we need to, if we want to solve problems, we have to create people or networks from the beginning where young people can meet, discuss, understand each other, and know each other. Because when you have an application and you have 3 months to write it, and you sit and you write day and night, you take the person that you know. You know, you can, how are you supposed to find someone? So if you want, you can stay with multidisciplinary, which I would say we did, which is added value, which was appropriate for us because that's what they asked for us. But I would have liked to move more into interdisciplinary and then involving communities more and even maybe transdisciplinary, which is probably an illusion. But so multidisciplinary, you can substitute these words for additive, interactive, and holistic. Of course, if you want to do your PhD, you should stay in your field, you know, and deepen. So it's difficult really to have a career path that goes with interdisciplinary. So this is something that should be considered by funding bodies, I think, because just throwing out money, you know, big money, wow. Well, that's not really ethical, I think, if you want to really deal with complex collaborations. Joan brought up SDGs. That's another thing. NordForsk, in our project, we had to do a little thing about, and also in our final report, which goals have we worked on and what have we accomplished. I think that's from an international level. All the Nordic countries have signed contracts with the United Nations to follow, and we should all taxpayers' money, when distributed into different projects, should have this element as well. How do we work together towards what's considered these days to be a good thing to work for? So stress that. Okay, so which situation are we in? We heard it excellently from Joacim, but repetition is the mother of knowledge. So the global mean temperature in 2021 was 1.1 degree higher than it should be. We are approaching 1.5, and it will probably not stay there. What is happening? Well, we have these are just a few examples adding on to previous speakers. Increase of Arctic river runoff and more future landslides. I just also want to stress that I mentioned here average or mean values. There are reports that these could be rather not so interesting, because there could be extreme events that makes an ecosystem change there's a tipping point, changing into another ecosystem, and this is an irreversible action. So that could mean more on a local, regional level than average. So take the average just for what it is. What we found in our project is that there are local and even regional differences in distribution of infectious diseases. It could even be different from one valley to another. So increase of fires, absolutely. And if you have a moment over, why not look at Siberian Times? I find it lovely. You find lovely stories there that you never can imagine. And it's like New York Times or Los Angeles Times and all kinds of stories and also facts. So even in the east of Siberia, Yakutia is huge, 1 million inhabitants, but the size is like India, the subcontinent. And they have lots of fires, and how will that affect through the dust? And yeah. Snow extent and seasonal duration will continue to decline. Continuation of reduction of numbers and of mass of glaciers. Reduction of Arctic Sea ice thickness, extent and average age, perennial sea ice is being replaced by thin seasonal ice, sea level rising in Arctic Europe. This is just from a photo from Alaska, but especially in northern Russia, there are reports on railroads falling down, housing. And they've actually, I heard some years, I met this Finnish guy who was actually building housing accommodation in the sea outside in the Arctic Sea because of the rapid thawing of the permafrost. And this was an issue brought up just a few years back in Alaska, where in the graveyards the skeletons started to appear because of the thawing. So the community brought it along to the leaders that this was, of course, a hygienic problem for the hygienic staff. But it's also a very, very much a deep cultural problem. Because especially if you live in a culture where ancestors are very, very important, this is, what's happening. Who are we when we are in this situation, and what will we become? It's an identity crisis. And what about the future? Well, the human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. So we are moving from the stable Holocene that could have lasted for another 1,000 years to Anthropocene. And the report from WHO in 2010-20 stating that climate change may be the defining global public health threat of this century. And then we've already heard this, either direct or indirect pathways. Heat, floods, you just wonder what's happening in Pakistan these days. Droughts, vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, foodborne diseases, social systems. And more than 75% of emerging infections are zoonotic. And Joan Nymand and the co-workers, I don't know if you were part of this. Yes, you were, yeah. So I really like this. Drivers of infectious diseases were defined into 3 categories: globalization and environment, social and demographic, and public health systems. And with public health systems, we're talking about how you monitor and do surveillance of what's happening. Do you think we do enough of surveillance of wild animal diseases in this country? Do you remember there were a number of articles, because the journalists like this, that there was an introduction of a new tick that was jumping after people? Don't you remember that? That was like 2018 maybe, and it was in all of the papers. Well, it was part of our CLINF project actually, because before we just at Uppsala Veterinary Institute, National Veterinary Institute, they asked people to send in ticks, and then they would look at it as a part of this work. And so then people absolutely did this. So we did involve a community a bit, but I wouldn't call it interdisciplinary in a way. So anyway, they gladly sent it in with all the troubles that meant. And all of a sudden, hyaloma, this gigantic, big jumping tick, was found on some horses in Oxelösund and then further north, etc. And then also another tick, the tiger tick from Russia, was found detected in Jämtland, and they bring in new diseases. This hyaloma can bring in West Nile virus and others. So this was just random through a project. We have very little surveillance. It depends on on nice hunters who find a dead animal and they take the trouble to send it in for dissection. And then we have reportable diseases for humans and also for some animals, diseases as well. But for example, it's very different in the Nordic countries. Borrelia is not reportable in Sweden, while it is in Finland and Norway, etc. So although we think we live in the best of worlds, we do not when it comes to surveillance. Even I was surprised when I saw it. So climate and the national environment and land use is a big driver for infectious diseases, as well as water, and how biodiversity changes. It's said that it's losers and winners, and here you see that the winners are the smaller, more short-lived animals, and they usually bring in so much more of the pathogens. We're talking here in Umeå, when I say pumula, I guess you know sorkfeber. You all know. In Stockholm, very few know about sorkfeber. But it's that kind of animals, the small mice, that will increase. So we will see more of them, what is claimed here. And then we have human-made environment, pollution. We'll hear more from Arya shortly. Travel and tourism, migration, global trade. So there are many drivers, but definitely climate is a big one, the change. And why so? Well, we don't move that much. In Pakistan, they have to move, but they usually move inside, and Bangladesh, inside their own country, so far. In a period of time, it won't be enough. We'll have climate refugees en masse, most probably. But the animals move, of course. The polar fox is being driven out into the Arctic Sea by the red fox. That's one example. The beaver is moving north, like it did in Alaska, because the willows are moving north, and the lake willows. And with beavers, you have, for example, pathogens, parasites in their intestine that will cause diarrhea in humans. So when you drink water from a clear river up north, it might well be contaminated with cryptosporidiosis and Giardia lamblia, for example. By now, I think you all agree that climate change and the ecosystem health is well connected with human well-being, and we have all the species moving around here. So we looked at a number of potentially climate-sensitive infections, and when I presented this in 2016 in Norway, an infectious disease colleague in the audience said, well, you know, infections in the Arctic, could it really be interesting? And just a few weeks later, there was this anthrax outbreak on the Yamal Peninsula in Russia. And partly because of the thawing of the permafrost. That's not the full answer, but that's another story. But definitely thawing. And they have, like in the Siberian Arctic, they have 7,000 graveyards with animals buried because they died of anthrax. We have anthrax in Sweden as well, but it's highly regulated. Here, they don't really know exactly where it is, etc., etc. And it's thawing. And you can just imagine to try to dig a grave in the permafrost. You don't do it too deeply. If you want to read more about what we have accomplished, you can look at clinf.org. So anyway, this is just one that we are working with now. 6 out of 8 zoonoses that I briefly showed you showed a significant change. And I don't have a pointer, but to the left you have latitudes, so you can see that it's moving northwards. Thomas Tirfelter made these maps. And so we have a database that's open for everyone, and that's very important ethical thing, because so much taxpayers' money through the years have been put into creation of different databases, and then when the project has ended, that's it. So there is, with modern technology, our methods and statistical capacity, maybe we can use different sources, put it together, and get the truth out of it, facts. We also have, of course, landscape. We have climate data from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, and then also lots of landscape variables. So what we did was to look at regional levels, and the money to collaborate with Russia was actually to try to do regionally there as well. But that, yeah. So you see Siberia. 22% of the Earth is permafrost. The biggest tundra is in Siberia. And we have, at the moment, no access to data. We have 3 huge rivers flowing into the Arctic Sea. The Ob, I visited there a couple of years back. At times of the year, during the year, it is 60 kilometers wide. You can just imagine the debris it's bringing out into the Arctic Sea, and you saw the currents being there, taking it within a couple of weeks all around the globe. It's interconnected. And we know very little of what's in there. So we really need to get facts. The EU funded project Interact is working very well. It's been going on for quite some time. They have 98 research stations all around the Arctic to collect data. And one is at the River Ob, that's why I visited there. So it's really, this current situation is so terribly sad for many different reasons. Of course, I must also talk about the importance of local knowledge. We have people who have lived in the Arctic for millennia. They usually, in many parts, have an oral tradition. It's really needed to grasp this knowledge and make use of it. I mean, if you have survived here for millennia, you know a lot. Also, it's a question of human rights. The first slide you saw is that, people, this is the San people in the Kalahari Desert. Not very many left. And here we have the Swedish Sami. And the Swedish state has not yet, to my knowledge, ratified ILO 169, which is a constant complaint from the United Nations that Sweden has not. You all know, many of you are familiar with this. So this is certainly, ethical things that's on a national level and also on a regional level. not everyone wants to go to the Konsum or ICA. We must show respect to communicators. They shouldn't be flooded with hate and threats to their lives. I don't know how you deal with this. It's an ethical problem for all of us. I think they really should go after these IP addresses and look at who is doing this. You can't just open your mouth and do, silence people like this. I think somehow this has to be dealt with, social media and how you're allowed to express yourself. There are good things happening in Greenland. The University of Greenland, which is expanding even into starting with the medical faculty. They have the Institute of Health, Nature and Health. It's the first in the world. I mean, solutions might not be found at Harvard or Oxford, but, anywhere. And maybe especially here. And I think this is just a way of thinking is so avant-garde and interesting. Happy days. Just 3 years ago at the Moscow State University, one of the biggest, the biggest university where they have a marvelous department of geography. And we were doing great things with them. But we work on. We don't lose hope. We work on. So I'm co-arranging this Species on the Move. And it's not just for ecologists, because we're trying to expand our networks so we can work interdisciplinary, not only with communities, but also with other fields. And this is, I wanted to, if someone here is a medical student, this is the Swedish branch of the International Federation of Medical Students, who are very much into health and climate change. And so the younger generation has a lot of energy. Health might be a good approach to reach out to people about climate change. Lots of researchers, a number of good thinking researchers think that. Sir Andy Haynes, I just visited, I just participated yesterday in a symposium on planetary health. And he just came with a book, Planetary Health, which is recommendable if you really want to get into it. It's not too difficult to understand. We talk about ecosystem and their services. It sounds like, what can they do for us? But what can we do for the ecosystem? Just this morning or yesterday, I read that the Swedish Parliament has now said no to repairing damaged nature, although the EU Commission has, suggested to all member states that this should be done. The Riksdagen voted just this week, I guess, and said no, because it would hurt the forest industry. So a 4-year-old like this one can be in reverence of what he sees. And I just wonder, when do we lose this reverence? What kind of people are we? Maybe it's time to go back to feel this reverence again for nature and ecosystem. And let's produce some service back to the ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you for these important points. Questions? Comments? Don't be shy. Maybe these are such big things that people don't know what to, although everybody agrees very much, I think. There's a question at the end. Back.
Thanks very much. I just wondered if you had any reflections on the fact that you end your talk with our reverence to nature, but actually most of your discussion was about risks from nature. And actually you all other species were defined as risky to us.
Yeah, but I disagree a bit with you there, because it wasn't about risks from nature, because all these risks come from the Anthropocene era that we have started out. We lived in a Holocene stable era before the industry. I didn't bring in the history here because time-wise, but this started in 1769, you can say, if you want to date. And when James Watt actually improved the steam engine and later had a patent on it. So yes, but the risks are caused by us. And destroying, doing these things to nature. So that's what I mean. Maybe we should go back and scrutinize that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in light of what you told us about the various risks and how interconnected the whole world is through the ocean currents, for example, and other things. And this, I'm wondering just about the implications for our ethical obligations. So if we just focus on the ethical obligations of Nordic countries, just as societies through their democratic governments and definitions of public good and how they spend public money and so on. What if you could now, for a moment, just have a very influential talk to all the heads of states of the Nordic countries? How would you try to change their priorities based on ethical obligations that derive from the information that you have presented?
Well, it's urgent, and the one major thing, also in response to the previous question, is to lower the CO2 emission wherever you can. It's as simple as that. And then from there you can, start to fund interdisciplinary work and tell the universities to create career paths for young people that will improve health. But what Sir Andy Haynes said yesterday on Zoom was that maybe the health perspective is a smart, if I can use that word, clever way to introduce this whole concept to people. But we cannot deny that we are narcissists, more or less, some more, some less. But if it really hurts us, our bodies, minds, we might be more willing to lower those CO2 emissions, both as individuals and as a collective.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we need to move to the final talk of the session by Arja Rautio, Professor of Arctic Research, Vice President of Research at the University of the Arctic, Director of the Thule Institute, Group Leader for Arctic Health in Faculty of Medicine, University of Oulu. And her topic is climate change and the One Health perspective in the North.
So thank you very much for the invitation and very nice introduction. So that I'm amazed after all these talks now, and now going to more detail about the One Health approach. It's that one, yeah. So that yeah, we can also go to the next one. I see that when I approach the computer, there is some, Okay, so thank you very much for the help. So that I will talk about the One Health approach, how I have been involved in the different projects and how I understand it in a way which I have been working. I can say that I make already my PhD. It was a multidisciplinary way. And whole my career I have been working together with other disciplines. And so that I have been also writing jointly with people from the education or politics or other, because we made it together. So that that's why I think that this way to go forward in research and everything is the most important. And I think that it is also the ethical way to go to the big questions, to have all these disciplines together. So I talk a little bit about contaminants and infectious diseases, because they have been so much studied in the Arctic regions, and they are some of the things which has been focused. And of course, some words about some of the projects, and I hope that through all my presentation, there will be the red line of the collaboration between the different aspects. According to NordForsk, very recent report tells that in the Arctic we are 7.1 million people living, and as you see that 2/3 of the people are in Russia. And so that there are also 75% of the Arctic settlements. They are more than 5,000 people, so that rather big ones and rather small ones. And I think that one of the important issues is so that we should also make a research in the big cities and bigger settlements and also the rural regions. That is one issue I have been following during the last 15 years. But why One Health is so important? It is in all in the globe, the indigenous knowledge is based on this One Health approach. So that the health of the animal, health of environment, and health of humans, they are very tightly interconnected. So that thinking about the resilience and adaptation or individual or community well-being, it's part of the animal health and environmental health. And that's why I think that it also gives for the different levels of the thinking about the researcher or educators or policymakers, stakeholders, local and indigenous people, it also gives the possibility to talk by using this One Health approach. In some cases, there can be the diseases from nature, but there can be also health from nature, so that it's also the discussion and the view which we are looking, and the point of the different countries or different situations. And I think that this holistic view is also telling a lot what is happening in the Arctic, because it's so multi or transdisciplinary, and also it gives the possibility of the co-production of knowledge, and it also gives the very natural way to have the connection to the rest of the world. One important issue is so that it's inclusive, so that it also the community-based participatory approach. And I think that it includes a lot of ethical aspects. It gives also possible to build ethical guidelines, and also having this communication being in a way that it's respectful and inclusive to all. And now I go to some of the very simple part of the One Health, so that this environment, wildlife, and human interaction, which has been looking a lot in the contaminants, because all those things which is happening in the southern part of the world is coming to the north. Another issue which has been already talked a lot is zoonotic diseases or infectious diseases in the north. But this is focused on these two lines, so that we need to remember that in the climate change aspects, and there's also globalization and many other things which are not in this figure. About the surveillance and also the monitoring issues, there have been in the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. It has been running now more than 30 years. And it has been a very important issue for the global legislation and ban of the permanent or these persistent organic pollutants, and also looking forward the metals and especially mercury. And now we know that all these old contaminants, they are going down. But now we have also in Greenland, in some of the lakes or drinking water, there are some of the micro or nanoplastics, and also those chemicals which are included in the lubricants or some kind of these plastics. And that's also the thing that we have this connection to the other part of the world. And these contaminants, they can come to the north by, they are flyers or hoppers or swimmers. And as Birgitta said that these huge rivers, when they are coming a huge amount of water, there's also coming contaminants, and there are also coming parasites and many microbes which are from the southern part of the things. And the middle of this, there's a estimation, or there's a shown that what are the places where the human cohort data is collected. And you can see that Russia is almost missing the data. And I think that it will be also a couple of years or sometimes from now. I think that it's also important that we have some organizations like Arctic Council. There was one project, One Arctic, One Health. It was started by US and Canada. And we have had a lot of joint meetings and tabletop exercises. We have wrote scientific articles. And we have established that kind of networks where the Russians are also included. But now, of course, that is not anymore possible. And we will also have the meetings, this One Health approach, also in a global meetings. And I was so sorry that Russian introduced a very nice project called biosecurity. And it was focusing on the permafrost thaw, what kind of microbes and contaminants are there included, but also migratory birds. What they are coming, when they are coming to the north, what kind of things they are carrying. But now, of course, that project is lost. And then some words about the Nunataruk. Johan already introduced very nicely, but I want to show this slide so that we have this physical science activity, those natural scientists who are looking what is inside the permafrost, what is happening there. And then the social science activity group, where is a lot of different expertise together, starting from technology, and also the health is included there, and economy and many others. And then how to integrate the issues. Now we have been running this Horizon project 5 years. We have 1 year more. And I think that 1 or 2 or 3 years it came that we know each other so well that we can communicate in the same language and other things. But I very much appreciate about this possibility. This is very old figure. I made this 2007, and together with my good friend Erkki Alasaarela. And we were talking that when we, of course, medical doctor and toxicologist is looking in the middle are the humans and individuals. Usually there's mother and child. And then it's covered by the chemicals, viruses, animals, plants, and weather. And I think that this is rather what I understand the One Health approach in my work. But it is also impacted the health issues, the society, politics, industries, and economy. And the climate change is, in some places, it's a very big issue for the human health. But in some other places, it has not so huge. There are more pressing things which are more important. And this only shows that what we have been working in my team in the Nunataruk, looking at human health, mental wellness, anthrax modeling, risk for what kind of risks they are for the human health, and also the pollutants question. And I very much like this type of the whole circumpolar information. And this is one of our first papers was about the infectious diseases in human population in the Arctic. And they were gathering a review about almost 50 years from the different countries. And unfortunately, we were taking only Russian language because it was also covering Russia. Those articles which were published in e-library, what is like Scopus or PubMed or what we have in English site, and it was only 72 papers. And there are 2 countries which are missing, so that there were no infectious diseases during this period. It was Greenland and Iceland. And I think that it might be so that when they published in their own language, so that it was not in English. That is also the ethical issue. When we have this type of reviews, or we try to have as much as information, we have usually the English language. But the important issue is that in Russia there is a lot of articles concerning especially the zoonotic or vector-borne diseases, and of course anthrax has been one of those. Then we did the same, the wildlife infectious diseases, and very 2 weeks ago we published the paper, and it was bibliometric analysis, and we had more than 350 papers, and there is 1/3 of the papers came from Russia. And that is also important, I think, because we don't have this kind of surveillance system. We don't have that kind of monitoring which we have in the contaminants. And those animals and diseases, they don't recognize the borders. So that we need to do something in this field also in the future, now when we don't have any more information coming from Russia. And the mammals, the most interesting animals were reindeer, caribou, and moose, and then the others. And there were, of course, different type of we can see the politics and other things in the national way, like Birgitta just informed earlier. And we can also see that the infectious diseases in wildlife, they have been more interesting since during these 30 years, which we have been collecting the data. And the most interesting has been the parasites in all the countries. I tried to keep this as short as possible because I think that we are a little bit late. Now I have been talking about humans and animals and also contaminants and infectious diseases, but I think that we have not talked enough about the permafrost. And so that about those 7 million people, there's 1 million people who are living in the Arctic coastal communities, which was in our research topic, research topic in Nunavut. And this is Justin Ramage's article, some of the figures. And you can see here there's a continuous permafrost is the very dark brown, and those yellow ones, they are inland settlements, and the blue ones are those which are coastal settlements. And then there are the scenarios and estimates, what is happening in the next 40 years forward, so that there's a huge amount of new settlements without any connection to the permafrost. And I think that the permafrost is one important issue which we should focus more in our activities and actions, not only looking at what's there happening, but what are their impacts for the humans where they are living. One important issue is the drinking water. We really need to have a clean drinking water, and this is one of the outcome from the Nunavut project. The very up, this is a permafrost. Very up there is an active layer, which is frozen and melting and doing like that. And then there is ice-rich permafrost, is the blue one, and then is the saline permafrost. And when we are losing the permafrost going down, there's coming saline. And can we have the drinking water from that or not? that is a question which the settlements need to handle now, when they have also the huge amount of economical issues at the same time. And I think that is also the thing that we need to have this discussion and thinking about also the future aspects. And then anthrax was already mentioned by Birgitta, so that's also important to have the models and other things, how they are going to be in the different regions, what are the risk areas. And in the right hand, there's mercury in soil. And this has been found that already on 30 centimeters in the permafrost, when it's disappearing, in some of the places, more mercury is coming up. And if we take 3 meters or so, that there's a huge amount of mercury. And that's have been already seen that it's a little bit increasing nowadays. And then I think that what all these issues under the climate change and permafrost thaw, what kind of they are for human health. And I think that Arctic people, they like to be in the nature. And it is also giving the more health. But if we are thinking that in our topic of the research project was the effect of permafrost thaw on, and we are, I think, that many ways thinking, of course, because we have been said that they need to be risks, they need to be that kind of, as I already shown, that what is going on to the drinking water. But it is also giving another type. But when we have these 3 areas which already Joan showed, we notice that in all these cases the self-estimated health was good, quality of life was good, and satisfaction of the life was good. And it is also in Långebø, which is not the indigenous community. We have also the results from Russia, from Yakutia. We have interviews and questionnaire, which has been done before the COVID. And there might be some new type of the information, and it also shows that it is only one place, and then we go to another, and the situation can be changed. But it is also so that people were happy that the children can go to swim, and they have also the possibility to have vegetables and other things, because people are adapting so quickly, and some of them, they told that whenever there is some kind of winter, that is a good thing. Of course, that is a good, that it's not so cold. And thinking about the high level of the suicides in the Arctic, at least in these 3 cases, it can be said that the reasons they are in other social or other issues, not in the permafrost thaw and the climate change. Just Joan already very nicely informed. So thank you very much. And this is my research group in Oulu, and thank you for your listening.
To these questions, and thank you so much for keeping the time. That was excellent. You're saving our necks now. So, questions or comments?
Hello, thank you for that talk. It was very interesting. I have a question that Birgitta touched on as well, which was the cooperation with the Russians. Mm-hmm. I understand this is sensitive now because of war, but do you think it's a problem that you can no longer have, statistics, information, and cooperation with them, since they have so much of the permafrost, for example, or because you're lacking the statistics of infectious diseases there? Like, how much is that limiting your work?
I think that it's limiting totally, because of course it's very interesting, because we have legislations, we have laws, we have ethics, and we have also the national, how I could say, in Finland, it is very clearly said that we don't do the collaboration, and the university is saying the same. So that is a big dilemma, and I have that kind of opinion that if we have already collected the data, and then we need to write it together, I think that that's fair, because if you have interviews, you have collected data, and it's unethical not to publish that. But it is a big issue, and it is also a big issue if you have discussed with your colleagues and thinking to have that kind of research project. Are you stolen these ideas when you do that alone? And I think that we don't talk that, not at all. We looked at whose name is there, whose institute is there, what is possible to do and what is not. And if your rector or someone else find that, okay, are you doing correctly according to the guidelines and orders? That's a bad feeling, but we have not discussed so much. Of course, the EU is saying that you don't do, and that's absolutely you don't do. But that is very, very difficult. But I don't start any new. This article about the wildlife infections, there is Olga from Moscow with us, but we submitted that before the war. I don't know if now I wash my hands in this.
Thank you. Are there other questions, comments? Maybe I can, since we have a little bit of time, so I can ask this question that, what do you think, so you, the impression mostly that I'm getting from these talks is that, this is not an ethics question necessarily, but it's about the question of these different diseases. Like it sounds more like there's lots of emergence of diseases that might have been more like in the south, and now we are also seeing it more in the north. But do you also feel that there is a very big risk for kind of indigenous things which actually would only emerge now in totally new kinds of diseases or parasites or whatever that might now emerge in Nordic countries or in the Arctic area, when like something that would not have been seen anywhere before?
I think that Russia is the most in danger. It is my I don't know if Birgitta is the same. But I think that thinking about our countries, Scandinavian countries or Nordic countries, I think that it would be very good to do more collaboration together. I think that it would be having this new methodology, combining the big data together, and thinking like that. And I think that the citizen science, at least in Finland, the hunters, they are very eager to collect the samples. They can do that, and also so that because they are all the time being in a forest or sea or doing the things, they see a lot. And I think that is one of the issues that we should more broaden way to gather the information and data, and also so that many indigenous peoples, they say that they don't know anymore nature. They don't know what is happening because it's so unsure, and it's happening, that kind of issue which has never happened before, and that's why they feel that they have lost their the knowledge. What is it's not updated to the day or this time where they are now, and that is also the issue that I hope that it will be discussed more and of course included in our, because it's also an ethical question, so that what we are researching. Yes. Are we researching what the southern countries are suggesting to us? I was born in Lapland, so that I'm a little bit north from the Arctic Circle. That's why I'm always thinking that who owns the Arctic, or somehow, and that is also one of the questions that we have. the different livelihoods and many other issues which are coming to the north. And it can be seen that many of the bad things, they are coming from the south.
Okay. So yeah, I can have maybe one more short question.
Just thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Just related to that, do you see any use of the Aarhus Convention on Environmental Justice? It was signed in Denmark, it's in force. It was considered by Kofi Annan as one of the most important pieces of environmental democracy. And I'm just wondering whether you see any use of it. NGOs in the rest of Europe are using it a lot.
This is a very difficult question for me because we can perhaps talk more about that. But we are now doing the research which has been done in Russia together with the political scientists. We are writing the paper on that, and that is also the things which we, as health researchers, we cannot see. And I very much appreciate, for example, the work together with Joan, so that during these years I have been seeing much more also the health issues working in the different disciplines.
Thank you very much for all the speakers. And now it's time for coffee break. Shall we make it shorter, 20 minutes? Or what do you say, Madeleine? Because then we would be 15 minutes late if we are back. Oh, what?
No, more than, well, not shorter than 20 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Let's try to be back at 4. Right. Okay.
Okay. Hi everyone again. Hope you had a nice break. We have been talking for the last 2 sessions more on the scientific facts, and now we are going to switch gears for the last session today, and this is on bioethics and moral changes. We have a very special guest from overseas, and that is Cheryl Cox-Macpherson. She is a professor in bioethics at the School of Medicine, St. George University of Grenada in the West Indies. She has been addressing the question why bioethics should address climate change and how it might do so. So I will, the title of her talk is How Bioethics Can Help Mitigate Climate Emissions. So I give the floor to you, Cheryl, please.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to be with you even virtually, and thank you to the organizers and participants for your patience with having a virtual presentation. I'm actually 6 hours behind you and probably 10,000 miles away in Grenada, which is a small island, one of the small island developing states in the Caribbean region. So I want to start with a short anecdote. A colleague of mine who was a member of the New York State Medical Association told me a story about going to a meeting of the association, and one of her colleagues at some point stood up, we'll call that person Dr. Smith, and said, well, we need to be concerned about the health effects of fracking. And this was quite some years back. And the story was that everybody sort of took interest and said, yeah, that's a kind of moved on. And almost every month, Dr. Smith would stand up and say something else about the health impacts of fracking. And it got to a point where the colleagues in the meeting would sort of roll their eyes, oh, here we go again. And yet after perhaps 2 or more years of this, somehow the idea began to get some traction with the group. And ultimately, that society was among the very first to take a stand in the United States in opposition to fracking. So I want to come back to that story a little bit later on when we talk about how bioethics can help mitigate emissions. But first, I want to explain why they should. I don't know how many bioethicists are in the audience. I know there are a lot of scientists, and I very greatly value this opportunity to talk across disciplines, which is something that doesn't happen often enough about any topic, let alone bioethics or climate change. So to start with why bioethics should promote environmental sustainability, we need to take a quick look at how we define bioethics. What's its history and function? Fundamentally, it's to help and explore and help resolve ethical concerns and dilemmas and uncertainties involving human health. At least that's the way it's widely conceived of today by bioethicists and others. Historically, it wasn't focused exclusively on humans, it also encompassed other living things. And that's something that has been lost, although there are some of us who are trying to bring it back. So bioethics, another reason is that probably most of you, certainly health professionals who are participating, are very much aware of the role of autonomy in medicine and in healthcare. And bioethics was hugely influential in making a change from what was once all over the world a very paternalistic approach to medicine. The standard was do what the doctor says, the doctor knows best, the doctor doesn't have to tell the truth to the patient about their condition if they think it's going to harm the patient to know. And that has changed across much of the world, and even where it hasn't changed explicitly through norms, policies, and regulations, at least the physicians and other health professionals in those locations are very much aware of autonomy and are more sensitive to it. And so this is a positive thing for human research subjects and for patient care. And there's a lot of actual evidence documenting that reality. However, there's a problem in that bioethics has really failed to understand or express to others that autonomy is only one part of a bigger principle, the principle of respect for persons, and that as individuals, our ability to interact, to choose for ourselves, the choices that we have to us, that we're the opportunities for health or anything else, really are very determined by our environments, including our social and human interactions. So bioethics has really gotten lost in focusing on a very United States-oriented conception of autonomy as right. It's my right. And although that was never the intention, and many bioethicists would say that that's not what they believe or teach, that's the way the consumer of autonomy, the patients and other health professionals and the public at large, tends to think of autonomy. It's, well, it's my right to choose. But that's really not what it's about. So bioethics has really failed in making that clear, and I'll talk about why that's important for climate change. Some of you are perhaps familiar with the WHO's determinants of health, widely used and understood in healthcare, and those are centered on socioeconomic environments and then physical environments. But for the purposes of climate change and for bioethics, it makes a lot more sense, in my view, to talk about social environments and physical environments. So social environments don't exist in isolation. They exist in physical locations and structures and buildings and parks in various countries. They also exist virtually in social media and other ways. But I think you could argue that virtual social media type relationships are occurring in a built environment, because we're in built environments and we built the technology to make it happen. So the point being that environments, you can't really separate, I don't think, the social from the physical. So bioethics, again, widely coming out of the United States and Canada as well, is widely perceived as being about medical ethics and research ethics, when in fact, historically, it was much broader. And even today, it's actually much broader with the subspecialties like public health ethics and neuroethics and what's called genetics, et cetera. And I want to briefly mention global bioethics, because that was an early form of bioethics. And in 1980s, Dan Rensselaer-Potter published a very well-known book by the title Global Bioethics, where bioethics was applied to health, well-being, and survival of humans in the context of the global environment. So in the context of different countries, of the planet itself. And the idea was, at least some of the things he talked about were things like nuclear war, global warming, what he called global warming then, and global population growth. These were certainly big issues in the 1980s. They were actually issues in the 1960s, and they've only gotten worse, sadly. So my approach to climate change is that it's a global problem and it's an ethical problem. It's a global bioethics problem. But what's really interesting and hopefully helpful is to think about the impacts and consequences in different contexts, in different environments. So I actually have a chapter in my book that deals with Arctic and small island developing states. Of course, there are obvious differences in these regions, but there are actually a lot of interesting similarities. So coming from some of the IPCC reports, and then I actually collaborated on a study which we published contrasting two Caribbean small island developing states. One of them was more developed, more populous than the other. And we found differences between them in terms of perceptions of health professionals about the health impacts of climate change on their populations. And that was not surprising. Doing that work led me to certain reviews, and coming out of that work is some of this work from the IPCC. So the similarities relative to other regions of the world is that they're both remote, they're both relatively undeveloped, and in today's world, they've become heavily reliant on imported goods and services, things like supermarkets, which of course undermine their ability to be self-sustaining in traditional ways of feeding themselves, and also are very expensive. Additionally, other countries as well, but relative to most, these areas have really extensive coastal areas, and they're very low-lying. And along these coastal areas tends to be a lot of infrastructure, roads, buildings for ports or transportation, sometimes industries, factories, and also housing. So these are really very valuable coastal areas. And of course, that makes them very much more vulnerable to sea level rise, to storm surges or sea surges, which we have a lot in the Caribbean, and certainly to any form of extreme weather, because you're very exposed. And you can see in the pictures on the left, on the right, remarkably, just this week, the worst storm to hit Alaska in decades, and we're seeing a roof there floating in water, which is presumably come up pretty high to close to the bottom of the bridge. At the same time, what looks like a very expensive house floating in the floodwaters of Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico. So very different types of climates and cultures and histories and traditions, but also very similar impacts, at least from climate change in this sense. The repercussions and the recovery are challenging in different ways, given the context they're in. And at the same time, we're seeing in Washington State, this picture was published just yesterday, I think it was, and this is Air Quality Index, an opinion piece by someone who took their family on the first holiday since the pandemic, and found that the air quality was higher than was safe, and couldn't let their very young children go outside to play. So I think we all know that this is a real problem, and hopefully the rest of the world is catching on, but are we doing enough? Are we doing enough quickly enough? To kind of wrap up on this slide, the similarities fundamentally are that these regions have very little voice in the world, little economic and political influence for the reasons above, and they also are much more vulnerable to emissions. And of course, emissions then are increasing warming, they're increasing the extreme weather, vector-borne diseases, and that's very interesting because there's a lot of evidence done about how the vectors themselves are moving north. If you're in the tropical areas, you're seeing new vectors and diseases coming into areas that didn't exist. Similarly, in the northern areas, although the vectors and the diseases differ with location. So it's fair to say that emissions reflect failed policies, and there's some small amount of literature looking at this. And there is a forthcoming special issue of the journal Perspectives in Biology and Medicine which looks at this topic, not specifically about climate change and emissions, but about failed policies in general and bioethics responses. And so some of my comments today will be in a paper in that issue. Anyway, I think it's a very useful lens to look at what we're doing. It's really at the policy level that we need to be focusing. So policy benefits include economic growth and political gain for countries, for corporations, for industries. And you're all, I'm sure, very familiar with the chains of the high percentages of emissions that are produced by fossil fuels, mining, and industrial agriculture. And the benefits are disproportionately small for low resource countries and communities. So this then raises questions about justice. And I know I heard someone ask a question earlier about environmental justice. So justice is clearly an important issue for climate change and climate ethics and bioethics. Because we're seeing abundant benefits for some, other benefits for others, and very few benefits for still others. There's a lot of work these days about social structures and how they unjustly cause harms and worsen harms. James Dwyer has written about how, in the case of climate change, it's forcing people to become environmental migrants. Adaptation, there's no way we can not try to adapt, take adaptive responses, and those adaptations have to vary with the location and the need, obviously. But they require priority setting, and that usually means there's winners and losers, and that usually means there's more injustices. So mitigation to carbon neutrality, in my view, is really essential, and bioethics is doing a huge disservice by not trying to explain this point to people, because adaptation there's just no way that we can indefinitely delay or manage what's happening in the world in terms of the accumulating emissions. So Keisha Ray recently wrote about environmental justice and structural injustice, and in the United States, it's neighborhoods of color where we often locate our landfills and toxin releasing industries, and that's very well documented. So she wrote about it from a bioethics perspective. And that, it reminds us that things we've seen today with the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which has persisted for years, although there's a lot of work trying to improve it, and a lot has been improved. Things that happened with Hurricane Katrina, and numerous examples like that. So that, again, it's a justice issue. So James Dwyer wrote recently about the question of responsibilities. And he said, why should I and people like me take responsibility for this? We don't condone this. We didn't make it happen. Why should we take any responsibility? And he answers that with the view that my relationship to the problem and the structures that influence it give me a shared responsibility. So even though it's not me that caused the problem, I do benefit from the system. I have a relationship to the structures, the social structures and other structures that make this happen. So I share in the responsibility to change those structures that are disadvantaging people unfairly. And he goes on in his paper to argue that the more I'm privileged by unjust structures that shape the problem, the more responsibility I should take. So in a nutshell, why do bioethics have a responsibility to engage in promoting environmental sustainability? We contribute to and benefit from the problem. We particularly in bioethics claim to promote and value justice, health, and well-being. Andrew Jameton wrote some years ago about climate-related moral distress in health professionals for all of these very reasons, and noted that activism helps to relieve or alleviate some of that moral distress. The healthcare industry is very interesting. It employs bioethicists and obviously many professions. And the healthcare industry itself, there's a lot of work these days about that and how it is a significant emitter of emissions. And that's beginning to change. Sadly, no thanks to bioethics, primarily due to physicians and other health professionals who have nudged the industry and said, you know, it's somewhat hypocritical. Here we are promoting health at the same time that we're worsening it indirectly by being emitters when we don't have to emit as much. We can be more environmentally sustainable. And in the UK, there's immense progress with the NHS. In the United States, there are a couple of very impressive changes through the Gundersen Health System, Kaiser Permanente, and others. So bioethicists, like scientists and other academicians, have opportunities, have expertise and influence. We can make this case and we can increase the impact simply because of who we are and our expertise and influence. So generally we teach, we advocate for patients, we conduct our own research and scholarly work, we review, do ethical reviews of research, we inform policymakers who are good at communicating complex ideas to people from a diverse walk of backgrounds. And it's important that we start to think about how we do begin to inform more about the need for environmental sustainability. And I would say that a question that hangs with me, or a thought that hangs with me always, is how explicit or how subtle should we be? And the answer is that we don't really know the outcomes of our actions and our efforts. So it's hard to answer that. It's a subjective question. But in my experience, I would say subtle is more widely accepted by people, causing them to begin to think peripherally to climate issues rather than being more explicit. Whoops. Okay, so how can we help mitigate emissions? One thing we can do that many bioethicists have talked about, not just in the context of climate change, is using our voices when we're informing policymakers and administrators to draw attention to this. And quoting another physician bioethicist, Joseph Benz, recently, who talked about how bioethics really has not focused on these kinds of issues, and he's had a very long and illustrious career, and he reflects that he wishes he had thought more about this earlier in his career. And he talks about two former presidents of the Hastings Center, bioethicists, sadly deceased, Dan Callahan, who was concerned about putting too much faith in technology, things like carbon capture. Will it ever be possible? Maybe. Will it ever be possible on the scale that it needs to be to really make a difference? Maybe. Can we predict the potential damages and losses while we wait for that to happen, or once it does happen? Not really. So that's a problem. And similarly, Strong Donnelly, we shouldn't be pitting technology against nature, and often things like wetland restoration in the case of Hurricane Katrina will be better and longer lasting than building levees. So we can also do research in our own areas, turning a little bit reflective towards environments. There are two really interesting papers in bioethics recently that aren't focused on climate change or emissions, but do have a lot to say about them. One deals with built environments, and one deals with genomics. So who would have thought people in those areas would have begun to engage with these issues? And I'm very pleased that they are. And I think there's so much more that we in bioethics should be doing other than writing about autonomy and whether it's being met in certain locations or conditions and how to better meet it. Research ethics, likewise, there are people talking, at least if not writing, about should we be thinking about environmental sustainability and damages to environments when we're considering the social value of research or when we're considering the priorities, our research priorities. Similarly, we can encourage funders and editors, bioethics societies to focus on releasing calls for research, publication, and conferences dealing with these issues in bioethics. Sadly, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, which I was a member for a long time, has been very remiss and reluctant to respond other than lip service to calls from members and its an environmental working group or interest group to even consider the sustainability of its conferences. Prior to COVID-19, there were efforts over many years. I was part of some of them, certainly not all, not the original ones. And it falls on deaf ears that we should consider having our conferences be a little bit more eco-friendly. So other things we can do, we can host and attend interdisciplinary events for all range of different topics. We can, One Health, which was mentioned in the earlier talk, very valuable topic for doing that. We can go to talks like that and just ask a question about ethics or about sustainability. And we can certainly teach in so many different ways, reminding people when we focus on autonomy that it's not just about the individual and their freedom or right to choose, it's really about their relationships that enable them to choose. So coming back to the story I told you at the beginning, it's repetition. You know, we may not get it the first time, we may not get it for a few years, but we got to keep trying, and that's all we can do. So I really recommend that. And I think these ideas not only are valuable for bioethics, but for everyone who's situated like me, as Dwyer would say, who's educated, who's relatively well off from a relatively wealthy country. And that's in addition to the things that we can just do as average citizens, joining groups and such, watching, reducing our own energy and waste. So in conclusion, the health impacts of emissions are increasing, they're unfair, they're worsened by structural injustices, hence bioethics have some responsibility to respond. We can do so very easily in very small, subtle ways, just by beginning to integrate the topics into their work. I wish more of us would do so, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl, for a great talk and a clear talk. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. This is Sigurður. We've been in contact over the email. So thank you. This was very inspiring, and I do bioethics myself, so I took the message really much at heart. And I think I agree with everything you said, but it got me wondering, to what extent is this, is your argument, does it rely on the topics and contents of bioethics versus just any kind of professional endeavor? So, I mean, could you generalize your argument so that it applies to anyone who is in any kind of position for action?
Yes, I absolutely think that this could be generalized, and I think James Dwyer's effort there, using the language "and people situated like me," it certainly generalizes for him, generalizing to all bioethicists, but I think it also generalizes, again, much more broadly. The intriguing thing is that as healthcare institutions slowly, way too slowly, begin to become more environmentally sustainable, bioethics hasn't followed suit and hasn't nudged that. And the importance of that is that the healthcare industry is all about promoting health, and to do so at using unnecessary emissions. Admittedly, we need some emissions until we can find the carbon neutral approach, but we can get there. The NHS has pledged to get there by 2040, which is a remarkable ambition, and claims to be on track to get there, to get 80% there by 2030. The Gunderson Health system in Wisconsin, which is a relatively small system, is carbon neutral, and not through purchasing carbon caps and such, but actually through policies that it have effect, you know, the cleaning supplies that it uses, supply chains for foods, for medications, etc. And so I think this can generalize to anyone, yes, particularly those of us from wealthy countries, those of us who are educated, those of us who earn a decent living. But I think those who work in healthcare and those who work in bioethics have a particular role to play and a particular responsibility, because that's what we do, supposedly, is to promote and protect health. And if we're undermining that with our emissions production, that is not right. So thank you very much, Sigur, for that question.
Hello, Miki Gjeis. I'm a bioethicist as well. We seem to have gathered in this corner of the room for some reason. I'm from the University of Copenhagen. A couple of years ago, a Danish sociologist, Rasmus Willig, and a Norwegian philosopher, Joan Nymand, wrote a book together called What Should We Answer? What should we answer our children when they come and ask us why we didn't do anything? And in that book, they claim that any person working in academia who doesn't work to fight climate change is failing to live up to their academic responsibility. And you pointed to some areas where you thought bioethicists could do some things and should do some things, but they actually take it even further and say, if you do not engage in political activism, basically glue yourself to an airport entrance, you have failed your responsibility as an academic. How do you look at those sort of wider claims of what is the responsibility of bioethicists in this situation?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with the book, and it's an interesting idea. The reality is that with advocacy and political activism, in principle, yes, I agree. We all have a role to play in that, but in reality, we can't predict what the outcome is going to be. Right? You can't predict the outcome of gluing yourself to the airport entrance. And many of us fly still, maybe less than we once did, maybe seldom, but we still do for all sorts of reasons and legitimate reasons. You know, I have often felt that the emphasis on is a little bit of a digression, but the emphasis on the individual consumer not to fly, why are we not putting the emphasis on the airlines and the airports and the governments that regulate them to make flying more environmentally sustainable? Because it certainly could be, it maybe not zero carbon neutral, but it could certainly be more sustainable. But to answer your question more specifically, I think the reality is that we don't know the result of our action. It's that question of, do we be explicit? Do we be loud? Or will we have a better impact if we're quiet and subtle? It's about sort of like in personal relationships, we pick our battles, we choose the right timing, we think about the approach that's going to make a difference. Certainly, if you want to get attention, yes, you can be loud and you can glue yourself to the airport entrance. But will that make a difference? I don't know. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg, who's a wonderful example. a child when she began, and she just quietly went and sat on the steps, and that has had immense impact on the world, I would say. Not enough, obviously, but immense. So I don't fully agree with their view, but then maybe they wrote it simply to provoke even some movement. I don't know.
Hi, Cheryl. My name is Ellen, and I study bioethics here at Umeå University. I wanted to ask you what other questions you think that bioethicists should further investigate related to climate change, because you speak a lot about autonomy and that being relational to environment. Are there other kind of questions that you think should be investigated by bioethicists when it comes to this theme?
That's a really interesting question, and it's kind of challenging. There has been a fair amount of work on what's called relational autonomy. Bruce Jennings has done a lot of that, a lot of the feminist bioethicists prior to him, trying to express the views that the underlying theory to make those views more, I suppose, palatable, help them gain traction. So I don't think it's so much work in terms of research on the topic as much as helping people to understand, sort of reconceptualizing the issues that we're looking at. So when we're doing clinical ethics consultations, which certainly in North America is is a huge employer of bioethicists, that those people not think about so much about protecting the individual's autonomy, but begin to think about their autonomy in a broader sense in terms of environments and relationships and social structures and that sort of thing. What I do think is more helpful is to, whatever topic one is studying, to bring in an environmental component. That's where I think we're really remiss. So that's why I highlight the recent papers about the built environment in bioethics, which is not a topic that bioethics often covers or engages in. And the fact that they went to that and then also brought in climate change about it. Now, bioethics does a lot on genetics, but has not, the paper I mentioned with that really looked at environmental, built environments, climate change, and all of that sort of thing on, and social structures on genetics. So it's being creative, thinking about environmental implications and connections to whatever topic we're working on. I think that's something that we should be doing.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I just wondered if you had any perspective on the idea of decolonizing the conceptual field of bioethics as well.
So that's also a very difficult question. It's not something that I know a lot about, other than sort of as an educated person. I've not studied it or investigated it, but I know something. I live in Grenada, which is a Commonwealth country. Our neighbor is Barbados, which was until very recently a Commonwealth country. That's perhaps our nearest neighbor. Jamaica to the north of us is debating leaving the Commonwealth, and we've just seen the death of Queen Elizabeth, and it has made me think about this. And because of where I've lived for so many decades, really, I've seen the value. There's no question about the colonial history and the wrongs. That's well documented, and the responses to it today are totally understandable and supportable in many ways. However, the Commonwealth today, I think, and this is a personal view, has immense value in really capacity building for low resource countries, bringing standards higher in so many ways that the average person doesn't see, that I suppose because I live in such a place, I see the results, standards in terms of education, in terms of sports and fitness, etc. So I don't have anything really wise to say about decolonization other than the fact that it's so very complicated.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? No. Yeah. One more question.
Hi, very interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. My question is regarding when you talked about responsibility and that it depends upon the degree of privilege. Could you perhaps more in depth go down what you mean by that? Because privilege can be very wide, has wide implications, social, ethnical, perhaps economically, and so on, geographically as well. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by it?
Yeah, so actually I was quoting James Dwyer, who's written a lot about that, but there's a lot of work in bioethics about this idea of responsibility and what is it that makes someone more or less responsible for something. When should we take action? And one of the considerations is, will we be able to make a difference? You know, and so those of us who are placed in positions of authority or in positions where people listen to us, at least often or sometimes, have a greater responsibility to take action. Those of us who are in proximity to something, if we're a health professional and we're working in the health field, we have more of a responsibility. But the idea of privilege is generally, I suppose, that if you think, I think about it then, because again, I've lived and traveled in wealthy countries, obviously, much of my life, but I've lived and worked in Grenada, which is not a wealthy country, for decades. And so I have a foot in both doors. And people who have not traveled, I mean, there's an immense diversity. Grenada is not like remote parts of an African country where people are completely living in poverty. But those of us, even in poor communities in wealthy countries, I think live a more privileged life in many ways than those who live in a low resource country, in that they have access to, for example, maybe Wi-Fi, to food, to information, and certainly our ability to access those things and learn from them and influenced by them, even in a wealthy country, ranges immensely from those who have a lot to those who have a very little. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, so if not further questions, I would like to thank you again for an inspiring talk. Thank you, Cyril. On the behalf of NCBio, I would like to thank all the speakers today, or of our three sessions. I would like to thank the audience, both here in Umeå and online. And tomorrow we will start at 9 o'clock sharp. Andri Snær Magnusson will start tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you.